Welcome to the Department of Renewable Resources Seminar Series for February 9th, 2012. Our speaker today is Dr. Marty Luckert, Professor of Forest and Natural Resource Economics and Policy at the University of Alberta. Today he will be speaking to us about the economic prospects of poplar plantations in Canada.
Okay. Hello, it's good to be here. This series is known to be pulling people in from all over the place, a lot of outside interests. So there's a number of people in the audience here that I don't recognize. Because there's such a broad amount of interest in this series and broad interest brought in, what I actually did was put together a fairly broad presentation. So this isn't going to be a typical academic presentation where I'm going to show you the results of a study and go into a whole lot of depth in any one study. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you a research program. What's going on with respect to a research program. And it's a program which started some years ago and is currently ongoing. And therefore, it has a lot of different important issues associated with this general topic that we're doing now and thinking about for the future. So it's going to be a bit of a smorgasbord where I lay out a lot of different things that are going on right now. And hopefully that'll satisfy all the interest out here and lead to some discussion afterwards. So to put this into context, there's a lot going on right now in the forest industry. In some ways, it's fighting for its life in Canada. But there's two big trends that are influencing the research that we're doing right now. One of those things is recognizing that the world is moving towards plantation forestry. A lot of the world is moving there a whole lot faster than Canada is because we have a whole lot more old growth than the rest of the world. But future markets, future competitive advantage is going to be dictated by, as we get away from old growth, as we go towards plantations. And so thinking about what Canada's role is going to be in that new world is an important thing. A second big trend in that, especially for somebody like Canada who has to rethink its position in the world, is to think about forest biomass as being different things. I know that there's a lot of forest companies thinking about lots of different end uses for forest biomass right now. And in this project, one of the key things that we're thinking about is forest biomass for biofuels. You'll see that in a little bit here. So these are two of the big mega trends behind some of the importance of this research, which is dictating some of the things that we do. Now, the current research that we're undertaking and the future research over the next few years is part of a very large project. There's a Genomics project that was recently awarded to UBC on poplar, basically. The genome of poplar was mapped a couple years ago or something like that. And there's a lot of very high-flying scientists working further on these genomics maps to try to figure out how to bring it into breeding programs and so forth. Now the gels component of this, for those of you who are not familiar with genome products, all of them have social science components, which are referred to as gels, and I don't even remember what gels stands for. But they're basically social science components of it. We're responsible for the social science component of this very large genomics project. And the social science component in and of itself is not trivial. We've made a serious effort to integrate it with the genomic science. It's a fairly large program, and there are a lot of people here who you can see are undergoing these different studies that we'll be talking about as part of this genomics project. So basically, the way we start is to think about, well, what is this genomics stuff going to do for some of the social implications? And the easiest way to think about it is, well, it's going to affect two things. One thing it's going to affect is how much volume is out there, and two, it's going to affect the quality. That's the two big things they're working on. Now, there's a lot of different ways that these things can help us or not, and we'll be talking about that with respect to specific production processes. But as we go forward in this, we're in a little bit of a hard situation because the genomics is going to progress fairly slowly. It's a very slow process to get all these things figured out, get markers in place, transfer it to a breeding program, and all of those types of things. So the problem we have with the models that I'll be showing you is that we're not going to get the information with respect to these two big things very soon. We're not going to know how much the yield is going to be effective, how soon we're going to, or how much sooner the plantations are going to come online, what the survival rates are going to be, how much better the quality of the wood is going to be depending on different end products and so forth. We're not going to know that for some time. So our approach is basically to build these models which have placeholders in them. They have empty cells that we can fill in the information as we get it later on. So basically what we're trying to do is think about these genomics, identify the benefits and the costs as these things get put into the marketplace. Now, one of the really difficult things about doing this kind of research is that right now there are so many competing technologies out there with respect to different end products. So there's nanocrystalline cellulose, which I don't even know what that is. That's some kind of fairy dust which does magical things, which people are investing in right now with respect to using poplar trees. And there's all types of different technologies out there for biofuels being put out there right now. So one of the hard things that we have to deal with is the value of this genomics technology is going to depend on what end product it finally gets to and how it influences that end product and the value thereof. Well, we can't possibly know the future with respect to all the different ways that these different technologies will go. So what we have to do at this point is choose some that we think are promising and therefore interesting to a lot of people. So what we're starting out with, and what we've been doing over the last few years, is we've started out by thinking about just pulp. Okay? Pulp is something which we know is used now, know it will be used in the indefinite future. And so what is the influence of these different types of genomics on the production of pulp? Now, at the same time, if we want to take a little marginal step forward, we can start thinking about, well, what about the influence of this stuff on pulp and cogeneration of energy? So right now we're playing with some scenarios with respect to generating syngas associated with pulp productions. That's thought of as being one of the leading technologies by some of the CIBC people, Don Roberts and those folks, who are punching these numbers through to try to find out where they think industry is going to go. So there's different scenarios that we're messing with. The key to a lot of these scenarios is also, though, thinking about ethanol, because the project in BC is focused on ethanol and what they can potentially do for ethanol with genomics. So we're thinking about different ethanol processes, too. Now, not only do we have to think about those end product processes that might influence the impact of this genetic stuff, but we also have to think about the different production processes for the trees themselves. So, for example, right now the typical production process for hybrid poplar has to do with growing single stems for maybe 15 to 20 years, and they get cut down, and we have management regimes mapped out for those things. We have estimates of costs. We have estimates of when those trees should be cut down according to optimal economic rotations. We have estimates of the finances of that, and I'll show you some of that as we go along. But another scenario completely different is that we grow these things on a 3-year rotation with coppicing, and it goes dedicated to an ethanol plant. It doesn't even go to a pulp mill with cogen happening. So there's all of these different production line scenarios that get played out in the future, and right now we're in the process of proving of choosing exactly what those production lines will be so that we can do some of this analysis. And you'll see that inherent in some of the things that we do. So this is an overview of basically what we're trying to do with the current research project, where we are now and where we're heading. And again, GELS is just a social science component of these big genomics projects. So the basic way to summarize all of this has to do with what's going to go on with respect to the production technology. And we think that that's going to be influenced by a number of key things. The first thing is the economic competition for land, and the pure finances behind that economic competition for land. The second important thing is going to be government policies. There's government policies out there, which we'll talk quite a bit about today, which is going to influence that economic competition for land. And there's also public perceptions out there, which could be very important in terms of what happens to the policies. Now, for each of these 3 primal factors that we're thinking about, there's going to be geographical variation that makes us think about what's happening across Canada in different places. So, for example, with respect to the economic competition for land, we're going to be thinking about this, and we are thinking about this at multiple scales, from all the way from stand level analyses up to national level analyses, where we're thinking about the role of plantations in the entire forest industry. We're thinking about government policies in lots of different places. There's provincial policies that could be influencing this. There's federal policies in Canada. And there's even stuff happening in the United States, which trickles over into Canada, which could well influence what's going to happen with respect to economic prospects for poplar. And then public perceptions. Right now, our plan is to go after this by province, but we also think there's probably going to be really interesting urban and rural splits, and there might be other dimensions that come up. We're going to be doing this later on in the project, so we're not as dialed in on this yet as we will be as the project goes on. So, what am I going to do today? I'm going to basically follow that structure of those 3 big important things. Economic competition for land. Basically, we're working at a number of different scales here, which I'm going to be going over each one of them. We've got a research project going on in each of those scales. Government policies. I'll be reviewing those policies right now with respect to zoning, carbon, biofuels, taxation. and talking about what the potential implications of those are for poplar plantations. And then I'll talk very briefly about public perceptions because we haven't done much of that yet before I go to my conclusions. So first of all, economic competition for land at the stand level. This is some work that we did quite a while ago. In fact, Jay Anderson, one of my co-authors on this, is here today. If you look at the basic underlying finances of looking at a stand of poplar and figuring out what type of financial return you get to it, the work we did puts it a bit in the gray zone. Basically, you can get an internal rate of return or a return on your investment of 3-4%. Now, that might not sound like much, but that's a real rate of return, net of inflation. And forestry also tends to be fairly popular to a lot of big investment agencies because forests tend to have what they call a negative beta, which means it's counter-cyclical to other market trends. So you actually get some good ground with respect to forestry investments in portfolios because they can have counter-cyclical effects, and so that makes them more worthwhile than the internal rate of return suggests. But still, given current numbers that we were able to pull up, current being 3 years ago, it's a bit dicey. It's not very easy to be able to justify it. Now, part of what we did was used growth rates, which are very conservative. When we showed this work to ALPAC, for example, we were using 8 cubic meters as an MAI per year. And some of you guys who do this stuff say, well, wait a minute, I've seen 13, 15, even up to 20 in some studies on this stuff. But what we did was we took our estimates from the only sequence of known yields that we could find in Canada at Indian Head, and those included some failed varieties as well. Some varieties in the sample that failed, and so they died. And so we had some bad parts of the sample in there too, which brought down the average. So you might say, well, you shouldn't use the bad clones in there, but where we are right now at least, I don't think that we can claim that we can put these clones anywhere we want and know what's going to happen with them. Right? There are very big issues associated with can we get the right clone for the right land, and there's a lot going on with respect to that, and that's hopefully what the genomics will help. So there's a lot of potential to have these numbers go from the gray to the black with this genomics technology. And also, as you'll see, the government policies and what they will do with respect to carbon and so forth are going to be crucial as to whether or not we go from gray to black at the stand level. Competition for land at the stand level, but within a farm. This is something that we just started a little while ago. So you can think about just a piece of land that you have, and you're going out there and trying to figure out what the finances are of growing poplar there, and that's what ALPAC is doing in a lot of cases. But another really important question is, and this is how it's being adopted, is, well, what does it look like for the cash flow of a farmer? And this gets a little bit more complicated because it's not a standalone calculation with respect to the stand, but how it fits in the overall financial operation of a farmer. And so what we're doing in this context is building typical farms. And then you set up a financial operation, you have stochastic prices over time, you figure out what the cash flow of the farm is, and then you stick in a poplar plantation, which usually crowds out the forage. Okay? It's a mixed cow-calf, mixed oilseed operation. The poplar plantation crowds out some forage, and you find out, well, what happens to the cash flow? And that's some of what we're working on right now. And again, you have some carbon issues that could happen in there with respect to getting gains from afforestation and carbon if you replace forage land with plantations. So we're working on these types of models right now. Some of the big steps, though, that we haven't touched yet have to do with thinking about after-tax returns. Farm models don't typically do this. It was a surprise to me. I'm not an ag guy. But farm models typically don't do this, and it's actually quite complicated in the context of trees and ag because there's some big issues there, which we'll talk about shortly when I talk about government policies and taxation with respect to agriculture versus trees. So it's some further steps that we're going to take as we take this along within the farm. Now we got the forest level. Okay, so far we've thought about the stand level, individual stand of trees. We've thought about the farmer. Now, if you want to think about it this way, we're thinking about ALPAC. We're thinking about a firm that's operating over a very large forest base. They've got operations going on public land, on private land, and they can move their different efforts around between those two different spaces. And the model that Jay set up for his PhD had to do with exactly that question. You can think about this as being a triad zoning approach, where the three zones are, well, do I stick it into intensive management poplar? Do I stick it into business as usual? Or the third zone is, I don't need it. I reduce the footprint. To get my AAC, I don't have to plant stuff there. And you can do simulations with these different things, but the difference between this type of model and the models that you usually see out there with triad, triad models mostly now go out there and they say, okay, well, what happens if we draw a circle here, and a circle here, and those are our three zones? That's not what this model does. This model instead looks for those areas which optimally fit into those three zones, according to a criteria of trying to maximize financial returns. Now you might think, oh, maximizing financial returns, what's going to happen is, it gets pushed into plantations and the whole thing gets nuked because we go into heavy forestry. Well, that's not what happens at all. It does get pushed into plantations where you allow it. But the footprint gets much smaller than it is currently right now. Financial returns dictate much smaller footprints. Those long haul distances, which we see right now, disappear because they just don't make sense in the context where you allow more freedom for financial decisions across the landscape. So we do have a model functioning right now with respect to this. We play with scenarios like, well, what would happen if we were allowed to put exotics on public land? And see what would happen in those situations. Well, we don't have those. We don't have any carbon built into these things. It's a model which relies completely on natural aspen versus poplar plantations and so forth. We don't have mixed wood in there. So some further steps there are with regard to fixing that model in those directions. Provincial level. What we're talking about here now is land use change. Okay? We're talking about the white zone, and right now we're doing it in Alberta. And the way that this gets set up is we have a spatial model which sets up thousands of pixels, 20,000 pixels across the borderline zone between the green and the white zone, the top of the white zone basically. And it considers all of those pixels, and it does a competition between agriculture and trees. And it says, are there places on this landscape where trees are going to win? Now the CFS has been doing this for a very long time. They put together a model about 5 or 6 years ago which was looking at these specific issues. And when we started to get into this business, we approached them and said, hey, we've seen your model. We think we could improve it in a couple of ways. Do you want to get on board? So we've been working with them ever since. So a couple of things which we've done to their model, which has made it, we think, much more realistic, is we did two things. The first thing we did was we added a couple of optimization routines. One of those routines has to do with whenever you try to figure out the finances of something, if you just plug in a scenario and come back with it, it may or may not be the best regime, right? So if you think about figuring out the financial returns to poplar in a 20-year rotation, and you just use that in your model, you may be shortchanging poplar because it might be a whole lot financially better to do it on shorter rotations. And lo and behold, it usually is. So you calculate the optimal economic rotation, and instead of doing a 20-year rotation, it shows you, well, you should be doing 17 here, 18 here, 16 here. And that might not sound like a big difference. And originally, when we did the calculations, we said, well, do we really want to mess with this model? Because it's not a trivial thing to switch this model over to optimal economic rotations. But then we did some further calculations, found out, but you know what? The land value changes by about 30% if you use an optimal economic rotation as opposed to using just an exogenous rotation. So solving that optimization problem became a very important thing for us. The other thing that we noticed, and there's a lot of literature on this in the United States, is that if you look at just those net present values, those financial returns, you'll find out that there should be a whole lot more land going over to trees than there is. So the economic behavior out there of people making land use decisions doesn't seem to follow our calculations, doesn't seem to follow our models. And so a lot of people have asked, well, what's going on there? Why is that the case? And the answer tends to be things like, well, we're missing something, right? Our calculations, our model is abstracting something from something that we have to include. And in this case, what we've come up with that's very important to include is a thing called option value. Now, option value is about recognizing that if you take one option over another, for example, forestry over agriculture, you're foregoing some options because you're stuck in trees for a very long period of time. Imagine yourself as a farmer, and you've got a choice to either plant trees or plant crops. And you look at future price expectations. This is how options work. You look at future price walks, expectations of those prices, and you decide, okay, I'm going to go into trees. Well, you're basically stuck in those trees for 15 or 16 years. Whereas if you're in agriculture and things change, and look at how things have changed in the last 4 or 5 years, right, in terms of agricultural prices and so forth, you've got a whole lot more options. So that penalty to forestry is missing in a lot of those models, and basically we model that explicitly on a pixel-by-pixel basis for option values to figure out what's going on with respect to that inertia that happens if you have to go into forestry, or if you choose to go into forestry. So we're playing with this model. There's some technical things that we're messing with right now. When we set this up 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't have the computer power to set this up exactly the way we would have liked to with respect to interrelationships between optimal economic rotations and option value. I won't go into that, but it's a very difficult problem with respect to getting an algorithm that doesn't just blow up in computing space. Because as it is right now, these things run for days and days and days. And so adding this other dimension could be really difficult, but we might be able to get an algorithm to work now that we've got better computing power than when we initially set these things up. Where this is going, we've just recently finished some simulations in Alberta whereby we have these trees not just being grown at the stump, they go into different production processes like pulp and syngas. We can put carbon policies on there to see what it does and so forth, and to see how much land changes, how much land becomes profitable under these different policy scenarios. In this project, we're actually going to spread this model out at least to British Columbia and the 3 prairie provinces. The CFS is quite interested in pushing it coast to coast, so we could well go all the way to the coast, to the east coast as well. So a lot of next steps on this one. The national level. This is one that we don't have an official mandate to do, but we think we probably will do it anyway. It's not part of the project. We've been working on it historically with a guy called Brent Songen. He's got a global timber supply model that he's been running for years in the United States. And he can do a lot of these different simulations about, well, what happens if this becomes a big thing in the Canadian forest industry? So he's got comparative advantages built in to multiple countries all over the world, and so we can see whether or not this tilts something significantly for Canada. Now, Canada is a really strange international player in world trade. There's not many countries like us, and the reason for that is, if you look at our forest, just a very small difference in world prices opens up tremendous areas financially. So we're kind of like a marginal supplier who can increase or decrease dramatically with different world prices, because basically we just go farther out if it's better, and we retract if it's not good. What that means is we inherently have a very fluctuating industry, right? The finances for the industry are very sensitive to prices, and that has to be picked up in these global supply models. And so one of the things we've been doing with Brent over the last couple of years is beefing up his Canadian part of this model so that we can actually run these policy simulations in a context that makes more sense. These abstract away tremendously from real-world things. And when we looked at the Canadian part of the model, we said, no, you don't quite have that right. Let's try to get this better, and then we'll be more confident with respect to the different policy simulations we run in Canada and what it might do to the tilt of world competitiveness between different countries. Okay. So that's the underlying competition for land, the underlying economy and finances going on with respect to these things at very different levels. Now what I'm going to talk to you about very quickly is zoning policies, different government policies. And there's a whole bunch of different government policies out there which could potentially play very important roles with respect to what's going on the economic prospects for poplar. So the first one that I'm calling zoning is basically these policies which say where can you grow poplar, okay? In almost every province in Canada, you're not allowed to put exotics on public land, right? Many of you probably know a whole lot better than I do that the seed source is very much regulated, right? How far you can go from where those trees are cut down and how far that seed can be away and what kind of ecosystem it comes from and so forth is regulated in most tenures across Canada. So the prospect of putting exotics on public land is not very wide right now. The one exception seems to be in Quebec, where there's more latitude. And I can only guess that must be the Christian Messier effect. I don't know if you people know about Quebec and Christian. But he's quite an influential ecologist who's done a lot of convincing of people to allow exotics on public land. And I suspect that that's why they have more leeway there than they do in almost any other province. So right now in Alberta, there's very little prospect for putting anything on public lands with respect to this. But that doesn't keep us from putting out those scenarios, well, what if we did? In fact, at the forest level, as I was explaining before, we have done those scenarios to see what happens. And my understanding is that ALPAC is already starting to play those scenarios out to some of the NGOs. Because when you think about it, well, we don't want exotics on public land as a first blush response with respect to the perspective of an NGO. But when you think about it again and you say, well, wait a minute, you can meet your AAC with this much land and reduce your forestry footprint by this much, well, maybe we should start thinking about that some more, right? Maybe it's something which we'll be interested in as an environmental group. And so some of the simulations that we're doing, I wouldn't say disregard that policy, but we play with variations in that policy to see whether or not and what would happen if we put exotics on public lands. But that's a very big if. Carbon. Carbon is so complex and moving so fast and has so many different dimensions that it's hard to keep track and figure out exactly what's going to happen here. So if you start with the macro scene, right? What happens in Canada is going to be influenced by what happens in the United States. The federal government has basically said that we are in some ways waiting to follow what happens in the United States because we're going to have to come in line with their policy. 80% of our trade goes to the United States. We can't not be in line with their carbon policy. And so in the United States, they have this legislation which has been on hold for a long time called ACES. I don't even remember what that stands for. Jay could probably tell you. But it has to do with policies with respect to carbon. And the economists down there are doing their simulations according to the prospective ACES policies that could come out with respect to carbon. And so when we're doing policies, up here, policy simulations, we've got to think about, okay, well, what if the United States adopts ACES and it comes up here? At the same time, there's also policies happening which are cooperations between states of the United States and provinces, mainly Oregon now I understand, and some of the provinces of Canada. So they have agreements which are in the works across the border, which could influence what we do up here. Then we've got provincial carbon policies which are moving forward. And I won't say believe it or not, but Alberta is at the forefront of that, right? We're at the forefront of that by having established a cap, and you have to have a cap to have a carbon market unless it's voluntary, but we have a cap in place for emissions, which creates the potential for offsets, which creates the potential to get dollars for sequestering carbon in Alberta. But in order to get that sequestered carbon, the process is, well, the province has to set up protocols. And those protocols dictate under what conditions you can get those credits on your land. Now, Jay's been in the middle of these things, and there are all kinds of problems which have been coming up whenever you try to set up protocols for forests. And they're quite diverse, but one of the biggest things that they have to deal with is the impermanence of carbon in forests, right? All the ecologists here know that when you're looking at a forest, you're looking at a dynamic stock of carbon. And most of these accreditation schemes, and this is a big problem, are looking for what they call permanent carbon. And if you want to have permanent carbon and you're looking at afforestation of a plantation, it's not going to work because in 20 years you're going to cut it down, or in 15 years you're going to cut it down and you're going to have to start over. So a lot of the ways that some of the analytical models deal with this have been by looking at getting paid for temporary carbon. Okay, if it's not going to be permanent, at least give me some credit for having sequestered a ton of carbon for a year. There should be some value to that. And that's the way we treat it analytically, but that's not the way the protocols deal with it. So in the absence of having protocols that work on temporary carbon, we've got some really big problems with whether or not these carbon protocols are going to come into place and under what conditions. The afforestation protocol looks in bad shape because of that. The management protocol has some pretty serious implications in Canada because the companies only own the trees after they cut them down on Crown land. And so they don't get the credit, they get the debit. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think about, oh, do we want to have carbon? Well, it's a negative, and we only get it when we cut down trees. No, we don't want to mess with carbon, right? So long as those intentions are in place, those protocols are going to have a hard time. The biggest protocol right now, which in our simulations is actually influencing some things, are biofuel protocols. And those are substitution protocols, which say that if you substitute biofuel for fossil fuels, you'll get some credits. And those things are actually big enough to be influencing some of the calculations that we're doing. So that's where we're kind of focusing right now in our simulations. But it's pretty fascinating to find out what's happening as these carbon policies evolve and whether there'll be anything in it for forestry given the impermanence of forest carbon. Biofuel protocols. So this is actually a complex string of policies which has happened over the last decade or two. And most of you probably know about it now because the federal government not too long ago announced that gas is going to have X% of ethanol across Canada. And there are a number of provinces which have the same types of policies which say that there's going to be 5% or more. There's some provinces which beat the federal standard with respect to the percent of ethanol that's going to be in different gas. Now, if you just come into the game late on this, you say, wow, that's pretty aggressive by the federal government. They're putting a 5% standard on ethanol. And what are they going to do? How is the industry going to respond? Thinking of Kyoto comes to mind. Because what did we do with Kyoto? We said, okay, we're going to sign up for Kyoto. Oh, but what are we going to do now? How are we going to get there? Right? That's the process we followed. And how did we get there? Well, we didn't. So you look at this policy and you say, oh, I wonder what's going on here. Well, in fact, the exact opposite thing happened here. There has been a long history of different subsidy policies that are out there where the government has actually boosted up ethanol production such that it's already there in most cases. We don't have to import a whole lot right now to get to those federally mandated targets. And the little bit that we do import right now is likely going to disappear by by 2012, 2013? In 1 or 2 years, the projections are that we've got enough coming online that all of the imports right now, mostly from the United States, are going to be done. And so this is instead not necessarily a policy which is creating motivational behavior. Instead, it's a policy after the fact, which is being put in place to describe what's already happening anyway. So it's an interesting situation, but what's really interesting is what's going to happen after 2012. Because a lot of the subsidies are running out, and it's not clear, and we will have met those targets, but what's going to happen? What happens if all of a sudden some of these firms start saying, well, without the subsidies, we're out of here, right? I mean, they're not going to do that right away. It's not going to happen overnight because there's a lot of huge fixed costs associated with setting up these plants and so forth. But if the subsidies disappear, in the long run, if the profits aren't there, you don't renew capital. That's what happens, right? You don't renew capital, and capital leaves. So what's going to happen after the cap is met and after the government resources are pulled out is an interesting thing to think about. They're really going to be at a crossroads in a couple of years to see what happens there. Taxation. Again, this one is really fascinating. There's actually two big issues associated with taxation. One of them has to do with corporate structure. And the way we got clued into this was by knowing something about what's happened in the United States historically. So in the United States, in the 80s, there were a bunch of corporate raiders that went around and went after forest companies. And what these corporate raiders were doing was they would recognize a company and they would say, holy smokes, look at the value of the assets of that company who's holding timberland. And they would go in there and they would rip these companies apart because they could take it over, sell the assets for more than what they bought the company for, and make huge dollars, right? They were corporate wreckers. And that's called creative destructionism in the context of conservative election policies in the United States right now. And I don't mean to say that cynically. That's an important part of market processes, is to maintain efficiency through those types of things. But, so in the United States, these timberlands got torn apart, sold off to different people. At about the same time, the United States started having what are called REITs, R-E-I-T-S's. At least timberland REITs started to become popular there. And those are known as real estate investment trusts. And these are taxation mechanisms, corporate structure mechanisms, which make it a whole lot more profitable for private forest lands to be in a REIT. Now, these things happen to be huge, very large corporations, frequently held by pension funds who like that negative cyclical stuff that I was telling you about. They're held by large corporations because of the taxation advantages associated with REITs. At the same time, what happened is these things called TIMOs, Timber Investment Management Organizations, came up because these pension funds had to have somebody to manage these huge holdings of lands. Now, fast forward to Canada. There's been some evolution in the REITs in Canada recently. And the question that we're asking ourselves is, well, is what happened in the United States potentially going to happen in Canada? Now, they don't have the same kind of REITs that we do, and we're trying to figure out what the differences are and whether ours are less advantageous than theirs are, and where this might go. But there is some evidence in Canada that it's starting to happen for agriculture. That REITs, large land-holding companies in agriculture, could be emerging. And whether or not it happens to forestry is something that we're playing with. Because as in the United States, if this happens, this would be something very huge in terms of potentially facilitating poplar plantations on private land, right? Imagine large, large holdings of private land with TIMOs operating on these poplar plantations because it's advantageous taxation-wise to do so. So one future scenario to think about. Now, even besides these corporate structure type thinkings, there's a whole lot of interesting things that are on the farmer by farmer level or the individual by individual level, which we're trying to get a hold on. And those things have to do with, well, do you get the same benefits from growing trees as you do from growing corn, right? There's different taxation structures, and we all know that we complain about farmers getting subsidies, at least those of us who don't farm. Quite frequently, they do have some subsidies in the taxation system and so forth. So are trees at a disadvantage relative to crops, agricultural crops, whenever you look at the taxation structure? And the answer is it depends. Because depending on where you are and under what circumstances you are, trees may or may not be considered an agricultural crop. So there's some serious considerations there with respect to, well, is our taxation system biasing the field against these plantations if it's got to compete with agriculture on agricultural land? So taxation policy could be a big driver. And then lastly, public perceptions. Now, we haven't gone here a lot yet. We actually have played with this. We had an undergraduate course project where we took some simulations from the forest level model and we put them into what's called a choice experiment. And then we explored some of those trade-offs that I was talking about. Well, if you were to allow exotics on public land and were able to reduce the footprint by 20%, is that something which you would choose as opposed to this other scenario which doesn't have that in it? And by setting up all of these different panels, you can actually get quantitative estimates of the specific weights of those attributes if you do a careful experimental design and so forth. So there's choice experiments that we've done in terms of a pretest. We're thinking of it as being a pretest. And basically, that's going to serve as some of the background to do a much broader treatment of this issue, where we actually quantify some of these trade-offs in terms of public perception with respect to different options, different policies, lots of different things which we can pull together in these choice experiments. So I'm going to come together now. Some big conclusions. What's the economic prospects? Well, it depends on a bunch of different things. The first one is genomics technology. What's it going to do for us? How big a bump are we going to get volume-wise? How much are they going to do for us with respect to cell structure and those types of things to give us better meters cubed? And these things are going to depend on specific production technologies. There's all types of technological competition going on out there right now. Competition for different types of management processes for poplar, different end-use products. Even if you're just looking at ethanol, there's multiple different types of producing ethanol in technology, which are competing right now. And the specific results that we get with our analysis depends on, well, what production technology do we choose to look at, and what are the benefits and costs associated with it going to that production technology. Now, because of that, there might be a complete sleeper out there that we don't know about. And it might win in the long run. And that could cause everything that we do here to suggest, well, it's going to be even better, right? Or maybe the technology that we choose ends up to be a bust, that the engineers didn't know about this part of it. And they can't actually do it at a large scale or something like that. We just don't know. But that's the uncertainty we got to deal with whenever we do these types of simulations. It's going to depend heavily on the economic competition for land. And when you look at these things at multiple scales, you find different things coming out. Right now, at the stand level, it looks gray, but that could change drastically with some of these other impacts. The stand level within the farm, we don't have those numbers yet. But economic behavior suggests that there's got to be some return there because we do see that happening. We do see farmers taking this on within their operations. Now, anecdotal evidence suggests that in a lot of cases, these are farmers who do not mix it in with other things. They happen to be almost retired. They don't want to leave the farm. It's an easy way for them to stay on the farm and not have to do much. So in some cases, they're standalone and they might not be mixed in. So we're curious as to what it'll look like when it gets mixed in with ongoing operations. Forest level, all kinds of interesting dynamics with respect to what you do on public versus private land and how you set that up optimally. And some huge issues with respect to, well, are we going to allow exotics on public land? As we deal with these huge issues and shocks that are hitting public lands, like climate change and so forth, is there going to be a new vision with respect to designing forests as opposed to mimicking natural disturbance? And to the extent that we go towards designing forests, we could well see much more tolerance for things like exotics on public lands. The provincial level, again, these things trickle up. So long as we've got gray zone technologies, you're not going to see a whole lot switching at the provincial level on a pixel-by-pixel basis, right? There's going to be just very small pockets happening here and there where poplars can beat out agriculture. But depending on what happens taxation-wise, depending on what happens with genomics technology, lots of those things, you start seeing more and more of these things popping up and beating out agriculture on a provincial basis in that context. And the national level, again, Canada's place right now is tenuous. The exports out of Canada have remained somewhat constant over the last decade with respect to value. But if you look at market share, that means we're going down, right? Constant value in a growing world means decreasing market share. And so the role that we play in the future is going to be heavily influenced by things like this. We're a nation right now whose forest industry is set up to harvest old-growth trees. We're not set up to grow new trees. We do it because of regulations. If we're going to have a continuing forest industry in a competitive plantation world, we've got to have some policies and some structures which allow this thing to change a bit. And these are the policies and structures that we're looking at. Again, the zoning policies, right now you can't do it. In contrast, there are a number of other countries where they do allow this, and we're making some comparisons to current policies in Canada to some of those jurisdictions. Carbon, it's a hard road to slug right now, right? Unless the price of carbon goes way up, unless they deal with this impermanence issue with respect to trees, it largely looks like it's going to be on the biofuel side with respect to the impacts on economic implications. Biofuels legislation, again, that's kind of at a crossroads. We've maxed out the federal requirements. Whether or not those requirements hold and continue when the subsidies start to go down is an important thing to understand or try to figure out. And then taxation. Again, some mega trends in the United States may be starting up here. If things go in that direction, it could widely facilitate, potentially, things like poplar plantations. But then there's also individual taxation considerations with respect to how you can cost expenditures and so forth. Can you carry them for 20 years of a rotation, for example, which are very important to think about. And then public perceptions. Again, if we're going to have policies which move in directions which make the economic prospects for poplar plantations positive, it's going to depend a lot about what the public thinks and whether or not they think we should be going in that direction. So, this is what we're heading towards in the end, okay? Economists always like to try to get things into something called a benefit-cost analysis, right? We try to understand, okay, if we go into all of these different things, is this a good thing for us to do socially? All of these things that we've talked about so far, there's nothing in here which says, well, is this something that society should do or not? It just suggests what is going to happen with respect to poplar plantations. But is that where we should be going, right? If you want to save the forest industry, perhaps. But there's bigger considerations to think about, too. And so what this part of the project will do very near the end is to think about some of the social consequences of these different policies. Thinking about, well, what does it do to land values? And how much more does that increase in land value versus to agriculture? And if we have this uneven playing field, how much more value could we generate if we had a level playing field with respect to subsidies between agriculture and forestry? Lots of different issues to assess when you start pulling all of these different elements together. So the objective was to lay out a smorgasbord, and there's a lot there, okay? Hopefully everybody's found something that they can nibble on, and now we can load your plate up with full helpings with questions if you're interested. Any questions? Yeah?
Question, the models that you talked about, what's going to be the availability of those to policymakers for decision making?
They're not the types of models that you can hand off to somebody and let them run. So if somebody wants to know about a policy scenario that we haven't run, they can get in touch with us and we can try to put it together. It doesn't have the type of software where you can play with it really easy with an interface. You know, it's not user friendly. It's egghead stuff on a computer that only a few people can run, right? But nonetheless, we have been talking to a lot of people in industry, a lot of people policy making wise, to ask, is this an interesting thing to think about? That's been dictating a lot of the scenarios that we do run. And so they get some play there, but if they want something specific too, they can come back to us and say, okay, can you run this? And then we have to figure out, how to put those types of constraints within the model and so forth. It's not just a sliding thing where you say, okay, we're not as user friendly as Microsoft. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. You mentioned that poplars are mainly used for three purposes in your presentation: ethanol, biofuel, and carbon. Is there any work that similar works done for other conifer species?
Sorry, say that again?
Conifer species,
Oh.
such as lodgepole.
The reason we've been concentrating on poplars for a couple of reasons, okay? First off, if you want to look at the economics of plantation forestry, you don't have a chance unless you can get a rotation under 25 years, okay? Any positive discount rate causes the financial returns to be beyond 25 years, unless you've got incredible value per meter cube, like a black walnut or something, right? You're not going to get a financial return to that. So that's why we started on poplars. And then the reason we're focusing on poplars is because we've aligned ourselves with this Genomics project, which is a poplar project. But you know, we have crunched through numbers on different types of mixed wood management, different types of silviculture and so forth. And you know, the straight finances of growing trees is horrible. This is the only chance that we can see on a financial basis. Now again, you might want to grow conifers for lots of different reasons. But if you want to talk about competing financially, this is the only hope that we can see.
Messier's group is playing with hybrid larch in Quebec.
Oh yeah, I should say conifers versus hardwood. There's other stuff too. There's cottonwood. You know, there's other types of hardwoods that come out. But I haven't seen anything. I mean, the only conifers that are making it plantation-wise are, you know, like southern pines and loblolly and those types of things.
The one red pine in New Zealand and Australia, they have a 15, 20 years rotation.
Yeah. So you got to be in that neighborhood to beat the finances, to make the finances. Simon.
Marty, have you guys with your models looked at, because you use the average of 8 cubic meters per hectare per year, to say, let's move all of our plantations to southern Ontario to localize this stuff, because they, you know, as much as we wish to grow hybrid poplar plantation north of 60, it's not going to happen, not for a long time.
Well, maybe, and I'll tell you why I say maybe. First off, I can empathize with your suggestion. When I was in forestry school, my economics prof said, we could grow all the wood we need for North America in a very small part of Arkansas. Why don't we do that? And that struck me. You know, why don't we do that? But if you look at comparative advantages of the South and the North, right? We have some things going for us, and that is really cheap land. Okay, the land values that we're looking at, right? Sometimes they're $800 to $1,000 on some of this marginal forage land. You can't touch that in the South. So if we do get northern species that can grow relatively fast on really cheap land, we've got that going for us. And again, these rates of return that we're calculating, they're not doing any favors, right? They're blind with respect to those types of factors. So it does look financially viable. There are some potentials. And that 8 cubic meters, just to be a little bit clearer, that's the stand level one that we did. We actually jerked that around a bit depending on soil qualities in the land use change model. So we have shifters in the yield function depending on the soil class that influences the yield function and so forth. But again, anytime we use those yield curves that we estimated from the Indian head stuff, everybody looks at it and says, oh, that's too conservative, way too conservative.
I'm not sure whether it's true.
Yeah, well, maybe you're the first natural scientist who's into this stuff that I've heard say that, right?
Yeah, but those are live trees. Like, they've got 30-year-old hybrid poplar trees. Those are permanent sample plot data.
Oh no, I believe that, but what I'm saying is when I see some of Alpac's plantations,
No,
I look at reality and how many of these
Yeah.
plantations have we actually harvested and made pulp out of it.
But they're only 11 years old at Alpac.
Yeah.
But
No, I
Indian
think-
heads are 35 years old.
I think Simon's saying he thinks our 8%, our 8 MAI is warranted, right? That
I think it
conservative.
is warranted.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm not saying it's too low. What I'm saying is we better be conservative with
Yeah.
that before we get too excited and say we can compete with the eucalypt in
Yeah.
Brazil or something like that.
But again, you start looking at some of the numbers, which the poplar, we got U.S. poplar people on this stuff too, right? And they start saying 8 meters. You know, if we were banking on that, we wouldn't have touched this. So they're pretty confident they can get a lot more. And again, they have to get a lot more because if they're growing this stuff in Oregon, their land costs a lot more.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
A whole lot more, right? So it's not so straightforward as the biggest MAI wins, right?
Yeah.
It's MAI and land costs. And if you start thinking about opportunity costs of land and you start pushing up into the green zone, now this is something that Jay was doing with respect to stand level stuff. You know, what do we get for AUM? If you start talking about crowding out, you know, right now we let cows on there, right?
Like a grazing lease, a farmer that has a grazing lease that has cows on public land pays approximately $3 per hectare per year rent.
So if you start putting down $3 per hectare per year rent as opposed to
$62.
62 is what Alpac pays.
Just cross from the green zone into the white zone goes from $3 to like $70.
Right.
Comparable land, right? You know, right at the margin, it's very comparable. So
Yeah, but then we're getting into who has the power in this province. Right?
Absolutely.
And it's
Absolutely.
The Cattlemen's Association is more powerful than the oil guys. I'll tell you that.
They are right now, but if those numbers get out, right? If those numbers get out, it's not going to be easy to keep that false economic line permanently. There will be pressure on that, right? The ag guys are paying they want the CFS people, and the CFS people who have this model in-house, the land use change model. They're hesitant to do it because they might get censored, but the ag people want them to take away the green zone line and see how far it pushes up. Right? Now you run that, and you better believe that that green zone line's not going to hold unless you get a whole lot more economic value in the north. And so it's not, those ag people aren't politically weak. Right? They're pretty strong.
That's what I'm saying. They are very
No, but what I'm talking about is people who want to take that line away and get rid of that subsidy for the farmers, because they want to put canola and cows in a much broader area up there. They want to get rid of the green zone and see how far the economics will allow them to push agriculture. So those types of forces are out there. And that economic force being kept at bay by a zoning restriction which says this is green and this is white has over time held fairly tightly. But you can see in lots of cases there's been competition along that line and the white zone's pushed in. Right? Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. That's a bit frightening to me as a natural resource economist, because there's forests up there for a whole lot of reasons besides finances. But the underlying finances and understanding those are not so, they're interesting. Right? They're interesting to think about. Yes, sir.
So I have two non-economic egghead questions. So you mentioned this in what you just said, Simon. So soil fertility, you have that built into the model somewhere?
So the land use change model does have the soil types built in, the Alberta soil classification system in there. And so we do have, the pixels they're actually spatially located on maps, right? So whenever you run this thing, you see a map of Alberta and you can see that these little pixels have changed over to trees. And they're 20 clicks square, each little pixel is. That's why there's 20,000 of them along the zone. So you can see which ones flip over, and because they're specifically spatially located, they are in specific soil zones.
Okay. Well, I remember as a kid reading about a German industrialist who was going to build a floating factory on the Amazon. And the growth rates of the trees are enormous, but his plan was to deforest, and then by the time he got back to where he started, the trees
They'd be up again?
Yeah, but he hadn't done any soil testing.
Yeah, I don't think that would work that well. I'm not an ecologist, but...
No, well, there you go. So that's why I think about the fertility of the soil.
Yeah.
Because that's also, it's an input, because the trees, of course, are removing nutrients from the soil.
Yeah. There's people here who would know a whole lot more about that than I would. I mean, Simon and probably other people who I don't know here. I haven't heard a lot of concerns about the long-term fertility of soils with respect to hybrid poplar plantations. And maybe it's just because nobody's thought about it because it's 25 years.
First rotation yet. At least in Alberta, we don't know how good those soils carry that. Because we keep also all the vegetation down, right? The other stuff. These are not forests.
No,
These
they're
are
farms.
agricultural fields with
trees
instead of grain. So do we have to fertilize them, and do we have to do other stuff to them? I don't know.
Well, my second question, stream bank planting. Is it possible to sort of have your cake and eat it too? So when I think about the farmland, you know, the farmers that I know, to be honest, most of them don't like trees.
Yeah.
And I mean, they're good clearing the forest. So planting trees, I think that's going to be
It's a different thing, yeah.
But there's an interest, and certainly there's a lot of this in Ontario, in riparian planting, just to reduce soil erosion, improve water quality. quality, et cetera. So there's all kinds of ecological reasons for doing that. But would that be a possible, especially once you started to coppice this, you would establish your buffer zone, improve the water quality, but you would also have your biomass. Would that make it a little bit more sustainable?
Again, there's other people here that could talk to the natural science better than that, but on the economic side of that prospect, I don't think it has a lot of play. Because I believe you probably have to be so careful next to those waterways in terms of what you did that it would cost more than the trees would be worth. The way they're making money right now is like Simon was implying. They're setting these things up as agricultural crops. And you go down these things with machines that you can weed. You got to weed twice in the first 4 years or something like that, or 3 years. So they're set up like corn. And for the same reason you don't set up corn on hilly places next to a stream because you don't want to get too close, I think you'd avoid it with these things on an economic basis too. Now, whether or not you can have your cake and eat it too with respect to some other biological thing, there's other people here that might be able to respond to that.
Yeah, it depends on whether you put other values to it, right? If you make riparian zones and the structure of those and this erosion control, if you put a value to that, if you put a value to water quality, to runoff of the fields surrounding it, then of course suddenly it becomes something else. But right now, from a carbon stuff going to a company, I think I
But if you were to do that, would you do that with poplar, or would you do that with some mix of other natural species?
Poplars are riparian, or they are based on riparian species. That's still somewhere I have to wrap my mind around, that we are planting all these hybrid poplars on these upland sites, and that's the reason why I'm very, very conservative with that, because all what we need is probably 4 years of drought, and there might be your 15-year-old hybrid poplar plantation going downhill.
Yeah.
And but that's, we have to learn this yet.
Yeah.
And
that's what the genomics people say that they can choose for and help us with and so forth. But again, a lot of this genomic science comes out of ag, right?
Yeah.
And it's a whole lot easier to deal with year-round, year-by-year trials than to have to wait 15 years in the life of science is forever, right? So to be able to get the selection working at a pace that actually has good economic returns, it's a big challenge in the trees, as those of you who do genomics know.